the kind of progressive liberal consensus that was the reality before, they didn't really have good story. Or if they did, they didn't use it right. People get disenchanted with too much rationality. You got to have a mythology. You got to have a folklore. You got to have a unifying narrative. That's how I'm going to round out the trilogy anyway.
Yeah.
With these three books,
what's the next one?
Try and get a sort of a unifying narrative. Not unifying like everyone's saying one, but compatible narratives.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, we're looking into like serpent lore around the globe. From like dragons to the Midgard serpent and rainbow snake and all these ones. And we're kind of looking at it. It's always a foundational mythology, and a sense that this thing was here before, this world, and that it's not really good or bad. It's the thing that is around creation and destruction, and that struggle towards negative entropy, I guess physicists would call it, but holding the world together, getting homeostasis or stability in the systems, and becoming a better person, and then trying to be more of a good person than an arsehole. And it just answers that how to deal with arseholes question. I mean, and because there's values that come with this all the time, like whether you're St. George who has to slay the dragon or whatever, there are cultural sort of norms and sort of rules for decent behavior and decent speech, and decent what is it that there's the right speech? It's a Buddhism thing. This also was in Zoroastrianism: right speech, right thought, and right action. It's this sort of tends to come through in the serpent lore from all over. So I'm imagining, so I'm interviewing people from like Myanmar and Africa and all around the world. Of course, my Viking mates too, because I love my Vikings. And I'm doing this one with my partner, Megan Keller, and we're so I'm not doing this one solo, which is the other thing.
Yeah, right.
If you do something unilaterally, like the last two books, that's just your random words coming out. It's not, unless you're really solidly in your standpoint, then it's just going to be like unilateral stuff coming out. So this one's going to try and be more consensus building and more bringing people together, rather than just going, hey, we're the best and you all suck.
You don't do that.
Yeah.
You don't do that. But there is a phenomenon that you put your finger on, which I'm sure the listener has noticed too, which is in our quest for mythology and for lore, the ones that sound traditional and indigenous are given a pass if they're nonsensical in a way that traditional Western woo-woo doesn't, right? You talk about the majesty of the serpent and everyone's like, oh my goodness, this is so filled with ancient wisdom. You talk about Adam and Eve, which you spoke disparagingly about a moment ago, and everyone apart from Christians is like, that's just a silly book. Why would you believe such nonsense? But then you start talking to them about the indigenous lore and their eyes go wide and they're like, wow, I'm getting in touch with something that's deeply meaningful. I mean, isn't ancient nonsense just ancient nonsense regardless of which tradition it comes from?
Yeah, it's just, here's the problem. Damn, I got to use big words like epistemology and ontology, but, but your epistemology is how you make sense of reality, like what stories you're going to tell yourself, your inquiry and investigation into reality and how you conduct that's your epistemology. Ontology is just, what's real, what you know to be real. And that there's, this, of course, there has to be a common ontology. Everyone's got to have some basic agreement about what's real. There is gravity. That's a real thing. So the problem is getting all that mixed up. If you get the stories mixed up, as like you try to be like a what do they call it, inerrantism, with Bible scholars who say no, Every single word is exactly perfect and inviolable, and it happened exactly like that. So if you're using it as that rather than as a roadmap, for how you make sense of the world, then you tip things up. So if we say it like this, like the epistemology, that's what's true, for how you make your truth. Ontology, that's what's real. Now, if you get truth and real mixed up, and especially in a post-truth world now, everybody's truth is what they're thinking is the reality. So there's been this like polar shift, where the true has become the real, and
but
the
you're
real is
using
up for
truth
grabs.
in a slightly slippery way there, aren't you?
So
you're talking about my truth, my lived truth.
Yeah, I mean, so our stories, that's the law LORE. It's also the law LAW, because it's not, it doesn't matter if it's bloody, factually, this is exactly how it happened. It's actually carrying a whole heap of law and messages about behavior and like a universe of knowledge in there, like as a mnemonic device. And there's sex and violence in these stories, and that's there for a reason because it helps you remember. There's whole maps of land and meaning with all the ways that you have to be and interact, but then how you interact with the next people and the next people and the next people. These songlines go right across. These big stories, they carry the sort of rules and the norms of how to be, and how to pursue the truth. So your truth might be that the Southern Cross is an emu foot, but it also, the neighbors next door, they might think it's like the eyes of an old fella and a young fella who got thrown up there in a tree, and then there's a couple of galahs or white cockatoos chasing them. It might be different, but it's not. We sit around the fire with those people, and it's not like
no, sure, but
no,
what
it's
happens
a
to the
stingray.
guy?
Are you crazy? Southern Cross is a stingray. What's wrong with you?
What happens to the guy who thinks that the Southern Cross is just the way that we perceive a few balls of flaming gas in the distant cosmos from our particular point in the galaxy?
Yeah, well, then he brings that story. And there's got to be a story for that.
But is that a story in the same kind of? Is that the same kind of story as the?
This is the problem I highlighted before. Your secular sort of progressivism, it does not have good story. So you got to have story for that, And like, okay, so if you read Hawkins, like you read his story about that, he will still tell a story of creation and of how things came to be. He'll map that out. So there is story there. It's just not very exciting.
Well, I mean, this is the great challenge, though, of secular life, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, like, Carl Sagan, when I was in my teens, I read Cosmos. And, Richard Dawkins has a book called Unweaving the Rainbow, which is about the sort of poetry and majesty of science, or like the magic of existence, I think, is another one of his books. There are people, Richard Feynman, the great physicist, there are people who have sort of devoted their lives to trying to make the stories of what is factually true about the world as emotionally evocative as bullshit stories, no offense. And it's a tough ask.
Well,
I still think it's a mission worth pursuing.